Hi, I'm Lee Schmuckler. I'm here to praise Kamala Harris uh, for being the fighter she seems to be, and then secondarily to review some history about the democratic world that shows a serious challenge to that world that we've been slow to meet. Uh, Ask the question, why is it that we've been fielding for quite some time standard bearers, champions who are not prepared to fight against an opposition that's being manifestly taken over by a force of fascism or something, if you don't want to go that deep into it. I mean, I think from the beginning of the 90s, it becomes visible, this transformation of the Democrats and uh, Newt Gingrich and Rush Limbaugh uh, were not, they were dominant in the Republican world, and they were not anything like of the same ilk in terms of brokenness and wholeness of the Republicans of the era of Eisenhower and even Reagan. It happened starting then and only got worse. And during that period, the Democrats did not field anybody that showed what Kamala Harris is showing right now as she goes up against Donald Trump. She's ready to fight. She's up for the fight. She is relishing her opportunities that she avails herself, prosecutor versus felon. I've dealt with these rapists and they like him, and I've dealt with these fraudsters like him. I've dealt with cheaters like him. You know, I mean, in so many words, she's bringing it. I ran for Congress in this very red congressional district because I despaired of whether the Democrats would talk about what the Republicans were doing. This is back in 2012, and I had been such a passionate, Grant Park in Berlin. Obama was, like the second coming. So hopeful. I was thrilled when my son reported how all the students at Harvard ran out into the street to embrace each other the night Obama won. The Republicans very quickly showed that if they could get away with it, they were going to do something completely indefensible, which is make his failure their priority. And they got away with it because decent, intelligent guy that Obama was, who, if he'd had a reasonably free hand to accomplish things, would have done great things. He would have been the transformative president that he wanted to be. He wanted to be like FDR and leave and advance the country in all kinds of ways. Instead, by the middle of his second term, he's got no capacity to get anything through Congress and has retreated to the White House using only executive because he wasn't a fighter. Now, when did the Democrats last have a fighter? Well, I don't want to try to go back all the way to FDR and check everything. Let's begin with the age of Gingrich and Limbaugh. Right wing, the last time that the Republican Party treated a Democratic president as if he was entitled to the job was back in '77 when Jimmy Carter took office. I mean, think of it. More than 40 years. But then the next guy was Bill Clinton. Now, Bill Clinton was a genius of a politician. The limitation with Bill Clinton was that for various reasons having to do with the kind of guy he was, he lacked moral authority. So he could outmaneuver Newt Gingrich and win. So he was a fighter that way. But as we have a sort of the party being taken over by fascistic sociopaths, not not overnight, but increasingly. Bob Dole was just a ill-tempered, but fundamentally decent American guy. Newt Gingrich was not a decent American guy. Rush Limbaugh was not a decent American guy. Roger Ailes and his network were not decent. But Bill Clinton didn't have the standing to go after those people with the kind of moral condemnation that their conduct called for. And so he didn't. He was a successful president. He gave a lot of ground to the right wing to appease voters that he didn't have the moral authority to take with him in a more liberal direction, like on prison reform. He did a pretty good job, I think it can be said. But he did not check the rising force of fascism. And he did not prevent their completely inappropriate impeachment of him for something that no previous party would have. And the American people didn't care for it, so they got punished by them. They didn't get punished by Clinton for impeaching him over DNA on a blue dress. But it does begin, and I don't know what to say also about Al Gore. He got definitely out-muscled with that Brooks Brothers revolution down in Florida, and the way things unfolded. I don't know what I did send him through the one contact I had an idea of how he could turn that Florida situation to his advantage and have America behind him. And I think he would have then won, because I think a legitimate count would have given him the presidency, and that would have been a big deal. But the Republicans pulled out all the stops. They were ruthless about it. And they were successful in a 5-4 decision in the Supreme Court. The 5 Republican appointees gave the presidency to the Republican candidate, while 4 Democratic appointees voted against their decision. Gore was a gentleman. I'm not saying he should have done anything different. I don't know how to fault Gore. But he said, I disagree with it, but the American way is the Supreme Court gets the last word, which is something we got to take a look at after that immunity decision. But again, that's another matter. But if we give Al Gore a pass because he behaved like a good American boy and true to his oath of office to respect the Constitution, Supreme Court made a decision. That's the way it is. He disagrees, but he abides. Okay. I don't know that I want to fault him for that. I'm not sure he had any better choice at that point. But then when we get to 2004, let me just say this. Kamala Harris shows herself to be a fighter in a way that John Kerry was not. John Kerry got his campaign overturned in a way, or blunted by the way he got swift voted. I'm just going to make an assertion. I think that, I bet on this. I don't know. If Kamala Harris had been in that situation of being swift voted, the swift voters would be the ones who would have had to pay the price. But not with John Kerry. The Republicans behaved shamefully, dishonorably with the swift voting thing, changing the American war hero John Kerry into the war coward, and changing the guy whose whole conduct around his obligations as an American at a time when people are being drafted was disreputable and dishonorable, changing him into the war hero in the Mission Impossible garb that he wore. If if Kamala Harris had been in that situation, they wouldn't have succeeded in swift boating him. I'm asserting. I could be wrong, but I don't see it. I think she would have made them pay. She would have used that to highlight what George W. Bush did, which was get daddy's use daddy's clout to get himself a plum position, and then to walk out on the plum position when he felt like it, without getting meeting his obligations that were a gift to him for having a father who was chair of the Republican Party, former ambassador to the United Nations, all that. Pull strings, gets this brat off. There's stuff to prosecute there. They didn't have enough evidence to prove it. But I think Kamala would have been okay about defending herself. And then the next is the successful campaign of Barack Obama, who emerges into the presidency with powers and raiment just flowing from him. I think his approval rating at the very beginning is 80 or 80 couple percent. And the whole world is so enthusiastic that he gets a Nobel Peace Prize before he does a thing. But we know that the Republicans decided to make his failure their top priority, which is an indefensible position, which Kamala Harris would have prosecuted. But Barack Obama wasn't a fighter. He was a nice guy who kept on wanting to make friends across the aisle, and they weren't his friends, they were his enemies. They were consistently working to make sure he accomplished nothing. Exposing just their behavior on Obamacare should have been sufficient to disgrace them, but he didn't prosecute. I believe Kamala Harris is the first Democrat we've seen in a long time as our standard bearer, who's eager to prosecute conduct that offends her, morally outrages her, that's criminal, that's against the norms, whatever it is, to expose it. She's ready. When I ran for Congress, I started out with the theme, let's talk about the elephant in the room. And I said, I changed that to a truth for a change, but it turned out to be too complicated to work as a campaign slogan. But it called attention to there being two problems. There's the elephant, which in this case was a Republican Party, that really needed to be fought with the truth and fought with the moral truth. That was one problem, the elephant. But the elephant in the room idea had a second dimension to it, because when something's the elephant in the room, it's the elephant that's not being talked about. And so that was the problem on the side of liberal America that didn't have a fighter. This ugly thing was taking over the right, and liberal America wasn't talking about the ugliness of it and making sure that that everything bad got punished and wasn't instead rewarded with more power, which is what happened when the Democrats failed to field a fighter. I mean, they were rewarded for their Brooks Brothers riot down in Florida when W won the presidency. They were rewarded for swift boating Kerry when W got a second term, even though it was already clear he'd made a huge and somewhat criminal blunder in the way he invaded Iraq and ignored all the good advice he was getting out of their arrogance and just botched it in predictable ways, in ways that people warned them about. But they conducted this thing and but he got reelected. the war hero, got reelected over what they had turned John Kerry into, because John Kerry wasn't and then Obama, he gets obstructed across the board. 2010, the Democrats have a campaign. They don't even mention the indefensible conduct of a party that's trying to doing nothing constructive and trying to prevent the president that the people hired to do a job to meet an important national need, and they're doing everything they can to obstruct it, and then they end up promising dozens of times to repeal it, which is a scandal in itself. You let democracy work, and then respect the outcome. But they don't respect outcomes, and that's indefensible. It's not it's not legitimate to respect the legislative process only when you get your way. Kamala Harris is a person I think would prosecute that, but Obama didn't, and he ended up stripped of his presidential powers. They were empowered. They got more power in 2010. They got more power in 2012. Obama did win re-election, but to a presidency where he could get nothing through the Congress because the Republicans paid no price for the indefensible policy of obstruction across the board. And Biden's another guy who really isn't characterologically inclined to call people's attention to the ugliness of his opponent, no matter how ugly they get. I mean, he's seeing that democracy is at stake, and he's begrudgingly, but properly, called attention to it to good effect in 2022, and I don't know how well it was about to work in 2024. But he's not naturally the kind of person you need to have going up against a force run by sociopaths that are consumed by a lust for power, for whom there's no such thing as enough of power or wealth, and who are not governed at all by principle, who are hypocrites, who use principles just as a weapon, who don't even believe in the rule of law, who are not willing to honor their oath of office, who don't respect the will of the people if the will of the people doesn't go along with getting them what they want for themselves. That's the face of a certain kind of spirit that's so destructive and ugly that what you need as your champion in the field fighting this thing is a fighter. And finally, we've got Kamala Harris to do that fighting. If she keeps up the present quality of the way she's pressing that battle, we're in for some good times. By the way, that phrase, press the battle, after my run for Congress in 2012, basically trying to rouse liberal America to fight, in 2014, I published a series on the various platforms on the web called Press the Battle. And you can find that whole series, which presents the whole big picture and the immediate picture in America, on my website at betterhumanstory.org. But pressing the battle is what we have needed from the Democratic side for 30 years without getting it. This may be a game changer now that we've got it. And I want to talk about why is it that liberal America failed to field the kind of fighter that we got now until now. And I think that there are various reasons that are at least part of the picture, and I'll offer a few of them. having been a participant in liberal culture my whole adult life, let's say, let's take it back to the beginnings of adulthood in the early 60s. I graduated from high school in 63. Uh, and then conducting, for example, radio conversations with liberal audiences in Wisconsin, New Hampshire, and with conservative audiences out here in the Shenandoah Valley of Virginia, and liberal audiences in New Mexico. And this is what I see. Liberal America came to believe that conflict was a bad thing, that goodwill reaching across is always the right thing to do. I sometimes wonder if this grew out of the way the war in Vietnam gradually drove the hawkish part of the Democratic Party into subordinate position and allowed the dovish part of the Democratic Party and liberal America generally. There was a pacifistic element, a dovish element at least, that eschewed conflict. Conflict is, behaving badly. When I would call during the W years, and I had which is 2000, well, starting in 2005, I had a blog that was visited by 2,000 or 3,000 people a day, and I get into conversations, and I was calling for us to fight to press the battle with what the lawless W administration, already kind of lawless, look at the torture memo, was manifesting. And people from the liberal side would reply to me, why should we sink to their level? To fight would be to sink to their level. And I would say, they're fighting with lies. It's not sinking to their level to fight with the truth. But I don't know how many people I persuaded, because I think that anti-conflict ethic was so deep in the nice liberal world where you wouldn't expect a liberal candidate to do what Ronald Reagan did in a New Hampshire primary in 1980, when he really boosted his candidacy by getting angry about somebody wanting to take away his microphone. I paid for this microphone. And we find out later he dramatized that. That was sort of a setup. But in liberal America, you wouldn't work to set up showing that you're willing to be aggressive and grab what's yours. So that was part of the problem with liberal America. I also think that along with that, there was a certain lack of intestinal fortitude for the fight. I think that I have picked up for many years that in the Democratic Party, there's been a fear of confronting the Republicans for what they might send back, how they might punch back. Now, I don't know if that's the same fear as like with Obama, when he was clearly afraid that if he prosecuted crimes committed by the previous administration, which I think he just took an oath saying that he would do, I mean, by implication, to see that the laws are faithfully enforced, he comes back with, we're going to look forward and not backward. Well, no crime, except for in that Tom Cruise movie, Minority Report, do you ever prosecute anything which hasn't already happened? But I think he was afraid of the response from conservative America, that the Bush world would attack him. I think Kamala would say, bring it on. I just took an oath to enforce the law. I'm going to keep my oath. if they want to make an issue about the importance that the President of the United States and the gang around him obey the law, and they don't do things like authorize torture against federal statute and treaty obligations and all that, and whatever. And there were actually a number of other legal things. There's a whole book written by a federal prosecutor about the case for impeaching George W. Bush, because it was in many ways a lawless administration. Nothing like what we saw eventually with Trump, but the most lawless administration in American history, as far as I know. And I know something about American constitutional history, American history generally. But he was going to look forward and not backward. And I think fear was part of it. But in addition to that, the fear of, what happens when you go toe to toe? That's why I'm kind of eager to see whether we do get the debate between Kamala Harris and Donald Trump. Because I'm thinking, we've seen Donald Trump on the debate stage against a bunch of Republicans, and nobody's ever got the best of him. I mean, he was completely obnoxious with Biden, and Biden held his ground, but I don't know if he got the best of him. I think maybe Trump hurt himself by behaving like such a bore, but I don't know if we could say that Biden got the best of him. I think maybe Kamala will. Little Marco didn't. Low energy Jeb didn't. Lion Ted Cruz didn't, etc. But I'd like to see it. We have needed a fighter for a long time. And so we've got thinking that's like morally, a moral abdication to get into conflict, that book, that ethic. There's the fear of getting hit or bested in battle. But then there's something which I think is at a spiritual level that's even deeper. And that the weakness actually comes from being cut off from the moral and spiritual passions, because there's a worldview in liberal America which gives the moral dimension and the spiritual dimension short shrift. They're not realities to be honored and conferred with in a big part of people with a secular worldview. The religious traditions have it in spades that morality is important. I mean, we don't even get out of the first couple books of Genesis when God talks about the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And we've got God and Satan and these big spiritual forces operating at the very beginning. So the moral and spiritual dimensions are right there. But the secular worldview has taken a form in which the moral dimension, questions of value, are relegated to less than real, because they're matters of opinion. You can't prove objectively that this is better than that. It's all subjective. And when it comes to the spiritual, what can you say about the spiritual? Oh, people got these, woo-woo feelings and such. But that's not, it's not an objective reality. Well, one of the things in my Better Human Story is to show that from the evolutionary perspective, that is really missing the boat. I mean, we have evolved to have the foundations for both a moral set of passions and spiritually derived passions that have been put there. And the fact that they've been put there, evolution says, is proof that it was life-serving for our ancestors to get these passions, these experiential tendencies. It's not a problem that we access these through our experience. Our experience may be partly subjective, but evolution has given us a sense of this is better and this is worse. We're not the only species to have that. And that does provide a foundation for eventually saying there is a good and an evil. The good has got to do with what leads to the experience of things that creatures find positive to experience. There's no way value could have any meaning apart from creatures finding some experience more positive, others more negative. Even if the experiencer is considered to be God Almighty. You know, if there was a universe where nothing experienced anything, how could you talk about value? You couldn't. It wouldn't mean anything. Nothing's any better than anything else. Nothing matters if there's no. But in the current secular worldview, value is just subjective. Not looking at how the selection for what best survives, the life-serving selective process, tells us it's real, it's part of us. You know, we've got eyes and retinas and all that stuff. That's part of us. We've got experiential tendencies, and that's part of us. And all of it is, you know, to be considered. Prima facie, if that's the right expression in this instance. That having it led to our ancestors to take better decisions in terms of both experiencing things as better, which is correlated with doing the things which have we've been rewarded for seeking out the things that make us help us to survive. Eating when we're hungry, drinking when we're thirsty, having sex, all the things that and then a whole lot of other things that correlate with our ancestors being able to get their DNA into the future. It's all there, and it's a reality. It's part of our humanity, and it's there because it's been important and life-serving. Real important and life-serving. Same with the spiritual dimension. But the secular worldview that says they believe in evolution, but didn't do the work of deriving from the evolutionary perspective what's important to know about the moral and spiritual dimensions, gave those things kind of short shrift. Whereas the religious tradition gave people a sense of the importance of those dimensions. The secular worldview, which has this inappropriate way of looking at experience and what it signifies, has no way of honoring the reality that some things are better and some things are worse, and some experiences are of special nature that people get that deliver spiritual truths and have an impact that may change the whole course of a whole life. As part of the human genome, you can see it because it erupts all over. But until you recognize that these are parts of us, however much subjective and you know, cultural differences and all that, there's still a reality there that needs to be honored and we need to tune in on. And if you've got a liberal world that has not tuned in on those things, it sort of dismissed them as sort of second-rate things that derive just from the subjective and opinion. You know, no need to pay a whole lot of attention. Well, we needed to pay a lot of attention. Well, when there was a force taking over conservative America through Gingrich and Limbaugh and Fox News and Karl Rove and W and Dick Cheney and the whole congressional obstructionists on into 2015, when the Republican base has been led by propagandists to the incredible place where they can look at a guy like Donald Trump and say, well, that's the kind of guy we want to give the powers of the presidency to. You got to see what's happening over there. And if you don't have a concept in your mind that there could be such a thing as a force of evil, a coherent force that consistently works to make the human world worse, my definition of a force of evil. If you don't have a concept of it, that thing can keep on rising and rising and rising and taking over the Republican Party. And the liberals don't see that as something that they need to fight. They don't see it for what it is. They don't deal with it for what it is. And what it is, what it's becoming, is something that needs to be fought and defeated. That was true early on in that 30 whatever it is at this point. And it's now become so blatant. It's like W's administration was already pretty blatant for me, as far as I was so disturbed by how they got away with what they got away with. The way they used the war on terror just to use people's fears to turn off their minds and their perceptions. Cultivating fear, whereas a great president like FDR said, all we have to fear is fear itself. He presided over an actual fearful war without encouraging fear the way the Bush people did. But then we get to the point where things are so broken. The Republican Party nominates a man like Donald Trump, even though he's exactly what somebody like, say, Eisenhower, good Republican, or even Robert Taft, a further to the right Republican, would have said, oh, he's not the right kind of person to give power to. But propaganda systematically broke people, and the Democrats kept on not fighting them for what they are. We know in our guts, in our moral, it maps very readily onto what we are born to have within us. The idea that there are some things that should be seen as evil and should be fought. I mean, I like to use the blockbusters of our era of the last 40 years. I start, with Star Wars in the 70s and 80s. That first bunch, the first three films, it's basically good versus evil. And our heroes fight, and we are impassioned to identify with them and to fight with them and to destroy the Death Star. And then after that, there came the Lord of the Rings trilogy in the first decade of this millennium. One film after another. Big earners in America and worldwide, showing us how much we're eager to identify with the good that fights and defeats evil. Get that ring into to melt it down so that the Sauron, or whatever the guy's name is, doesn't take over the world. I mean, we're in that position, We don't want Sauron to take over the world. And we readily understand that when you're up against something like that, you need a fighter. Or in the case of getting rid of the ring, it's not just fighting, it's, struggling up the mountain to be able to destroy the power that threatens to take over the world. And then the third big blockbuster that I think should be looked at by the people with a secular worldview to see what we're supposed to do, that we know we're supposed to do when something as dark as what's taken over the Republican Party emerges into the world. And that's Avatar. Not Avalon, that's a completely different movie. Avatar, where the wholeness of a living world is depicted in spiritually deep terms. The tree on which the blue people hang out, it's like the tree of life. And it is threatened by the greed and aggressiveness of the military industrial complex that's willing to destroy the planet and all that's sacred on it, and in order to enrich itself and empower itself with getting unobtainium, the name of the elements or whatever, the metal, that they're willing to destroy the planet to get. And then our hero leads the battle successfully, except for so much that's sacred has already been destroyed. It's not the total victory that we would prefer as our times darken. It's not just the Death Star isn't exploded. It's just that the people who have destroyed big chunks of the sacred already are marched off to their punishment on some other planet or whatever it is that is happening at the end of that film. But all three of those tell us that what we want, our hero must be a fighter. When you're up against something like that, now, Donald Trump is up, and his ilk are willing to go to war against the Democrats, no matter how good and mild, and they turn a fifth of the Republican electorate as of a decade ago believe that this eminently decent guy, Barack Obama, is the Antichrist. So they're willing to go up against their enemies as if they're evil when they're not. And liberals have not been willing to go up against their enemy the way you need to treat something like the Death Star or Sauron or the military-industrial complex with its insatiable greed for unobtainium. Finally, we in the democratic world have somebody who I think relishes that kind of fight. And she comes at it from a strong place. I mean, she believes in what she believes in a way that isn't, I mean, when she thinks about the misogyny and the right of women not to be treated the way that women are getting treated by Dobbs and all the little Dobbses around Red America, she believes in that battle and the importance of fighting and winning that. The thing about believing in it is that it makes you it empowers you for the fight. If you think that, I a couple times encountered as a teacher at different levels, college level, sort of a selective high school level, encountering in the children of liberal America the belief what the Nazis did in Auschwitz isn't what I would have done, but it seemed right to them. So it was right for them. That's not how we feel in the battles in Star Wars and Lord of the Rings and Avatar. No. There is a commitment to the good. And I think there is something in Kamala Harris that doesn't question the validity of her moral and spiritual passions. I actually don't know. I see the moral passions. I don't know how any of this registers for her at the spiritual level. But the spiritual level is touched on whenever you get to the heart of a person. And when she says, quotes her mother that she didn't fall out of a coconut tree, that we need to see our place in the whole context of our world. I think she's pointing to a spiritual level. So I have great hopes for this fighter. And maybe she'll help Americans to take more seriously. Because we are now witnessing such ugliness that the upsurgence of moral and spiritual passion behind Kamala indicate that the limitations of the secular worldview can be transcended by just how we feel. But I also invite you to get the intellectual map that justifies all that at my Better Human Story. And I present it in video after video on my YouTube channel, and I present it in a very systematic way on my A Better Human Story .org, where I integrate our situation here, both micro in the day by day of the battle that we're engaged in against fascism, and the larger battle in America about what the future is going to be, and the larger global battle of our times where fascism has been gaining ground in countries around the world, to the whole stream of human history in which I identify a force that inevitably emerged with civilization, which launched a destructive force, a social evolutionary process that drove civilization inevitably in a way that human beings did not choose but could not avoid because the systemic force was out of control. And as a result of this systemic force was inevitable, and the inevitability I say I can show that I cannot see how it can be refuted, is such that any creature on any planet, anywhere in the cosmos, that steps across the threshold and onto the path of civilization, extricating itself from the niche in which it evolved biologically, which means leaving an order and plunging into a disorder that means a systemic dynamic that's very destructive, that will take a long time to bring under control. And we're more likely to bring it under control, well, not just by defeating Trump in November, but more generally to understand the larger force that's been at work in human civilization from the beginnings, inevitably as an expression of a systemic dynamic, not an expression of what we are by nature. And equally irrefutable is this proposition, I believe. Nobody has certainly refuted it. As a result of the systemic dynamic that I outline in that book, one comes to understand that the ugliness that we see in human history and that we see in the world around us is not a reflection of human nature. It's not human nature at large. It doesn't provide a clear window. It shows what happens when a creature steps into a disordered situation that had never existed before in the history of life on Earth. We've been at this for 10,000 years. Life's been evolving for 3.5 billion years. And we haven't brought this force under control. Important to know what we're up against. What we're up against is my 2019 book that talks about how important it is that we fight this fight, that we no longer have it be an elephant in the room, but it be an elephant that we have defeated because we are talking to the nation about it. The destructive force at work in our world and how we can defeat it. I think that Kamala Harris is showing how we can defeat it. She is composing good messages and delivering them effectively and with a strategic adeptness that I hope she can continue, because I think that this force that we're up against is vulnerable. The American people don't want it. They just have to be helped to see it for what it is. I'm looking forward to this campaign. Thanks for listening to me. Support, like, follow, anything you're moved to do that could help boost this, because I do believe quite sincerely that this better human story can help us win this battle. That part of the problem is that the religious traditions had a way of helping people to conceive of a force of brokenness, of a destructive force, a force of evil. It's just described, it's shown in the narratives that they tell. But from a secular point of view, we've gotten rid of the devil and his minions, properly so, in my opinion. But there has to be a way of conceiving, well, what is the it that we're up against? And that's what the intellectual work that I've been doing for more than a half a century, starting with that piece, but then moving also into adding other dimensions, which show that in the evolutionary perspective, we can see what we're up against, what the shape of the battlefield is, how all that bears upon how it must be defeated, and inspires us with the moral and spiritual passions to fight it and defeat it.